Before we dive in, I'd like to remind you to hit the subscribe button. Currently, only 0.7% of my viewers are subscribed. Once we hit 1,000 subscribers, I'll release an exclusive special video just for you. The neighborhood had always been a peaceful place, a little pocket of calm where everyone knew each other, and the occasional chatter across fences made the days feel warmer. David Richards had lived there for several years, his family settled and content in their home. He was a local veterinarian, known for his genuine love of animals and his deep commitment to their care. His dog, Max, was a golden retriever with a heart of gold, friendly, gentle, and playful. Max spent most of his time running around the yard, greeting neighbors, and living his best life. Life in the neighborhood had always been comfortable for David, and Max was just part of that tranquility. However, all of that changed when Karen moved in next door. Karen was a woman in her mid-40s, someone with a strong opinion on nearly everything, and she wasn't shy about sharing those opinions with anyone who would listen. From the very first day she arrived, it was clear that she had an agenda to make sure everything in the neighborhood conformed to her idea of how things should be. The lawn had to be mowed exactly once a week, the trash bins had to be neatly hidden away, and any noise had to be kept to a minimum. She had a way of looking at everything as though it was an affront to her perfect vision of suburban life. David had heard the rumors. Karen was already making waves in the neighborhood, not only with her demands for stricter adherence to the community's HOA rules, but also with her endless criticisms of her neighbors. So when she came over to David's house one sunny afternoon, it wasn't entirely a surprise, though it was certainly unsettling. Max had been out in the yard, chasing a ball when Karen appeared at the gate. She stood there, hands on hips, staring at the dog with an expression that could only be described as disapproval. "I can't help but notice your dog is always out here making a racket," she said, her tone sharp. "You really should keep him inside. It's causing a disturbance. We don't want that kind of behavior in our neighborhood." David was taken aback by her directness. He had known the neighbors in this area for years, and no one had ever had an issue with Max. He calmly smiled and explained that Max was a friendly dog, trained to be calm and quiet. David reassured her that Max was harmless and that there was no need to be concerned. But Karen wasn't having it. Her eyes narrowed, and her posture became even more rigid. "I've seen how he acts when you're not around," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "You may think he's harmless, but not everyone appreciates that kind of noise. It's unsettling and it's not acceptable. I'm going to report this to the HOA." David, still trying to maintain his composure, explained that Max was a well-behaved dog, and this wasn't something that needed to be escalated. But Karen was already making up her mind. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked back to her house, muttering under her breath. David shook his head, wondering if he had just had the most bizarre interaction of his life. He couldn't fathom what had just happened. Max, his best friend, a dog who had never hurt anyone, was now being painted as a neighborhood menace by a woman who had been here for less than a week. But the truth of the matter was, this was just the beginning. A few days later, David received a formal letter from the HOA. The letter was short but to the point. Karen had filed an official complaint about Max's behavior, claiming that his constant barking was disrupting the peace. She even included a list of alleged incidents, all of which were fabricated or exaggerated, making Max out to be some sort of unruly menace. The HOA requested that David attend a meeting to discuss the matter. David couldn't believe it. Max had been nothing but friendly with the neighbors, and now, in Karen's eyes, he was a problem. He couldn't help but feel a little defensive, but at the same time, he knew that the HOA had to investigate complaints. The letter didn't say how seriously the HOA took the matter, but David knew that he would have to explain the situation. He decided to attend the meeting and hoped that, with a clear explanation, the misunderstanding would be resolved quickly. As the day of the HOA meeting approached, David tried to keep his composure, but he was anxious. He had no idea what to expect. Karen's complaints had thrown him off guard, and he wasn't sure how this would unfold. All he could do was hope that the HOA members would see things for what they really were, a new neighbor making a fuss over nothing. But in the back of his mind, David couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was about to make things much more complicated than they needed to be. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and David found himself standing at the entrance to the community center, feeling a mix of nervousness and frustration. The small parking lot was filled with cars belonging to other neighborhood residents who had gathered for the meeting. David could already hear raised voices from within the building, Karen's unmistakable tone cutting through the crowd. He took a deep breath, walked through the doors, and was greeted by the sight of Karen standing at the front, her arms crossed in front of her chest, a smug expression on her face. The room was filled with a variety of neighbors, some of whom David had known for years. They all seemed to be looking between him and Karen, clearly wondering what this meeting was going to be about. The HOA board members, a group of 3 individuals, sat behind a long table, each of them holding a binder filled with documents, including the complaint from Karen. Karen wasted no time. She stood up, her voice carrying through the room as she began to explain her version of events. As many of you know, I'm new to this neighborhood, and I was hoping to find a peaceful environment where I could relax and enjoy some quiet. Unfortunately, that has not been the case since I moved in, she started. I have been repeatedly disturbed by a barking dog in the yard next door. It's constant, and as much as I've tried to be understanding, it's become clear that this is not just a minor issue. It's a major disruption to my daily life. David felt his heart rate spike as Karen continued, embellishing the details of her complaint. She spoke of uncontrolled barking and how Max had invaded her space despite being confined to his own yard. The whole narrative she presented made it sound as though Max was a wild animal, terrorizing the neighborhood without any regard for others. David clenched his fists, trying to remain calm as he waited for his turn to speak. When the HOA members finally turned their attention to him, David stood up, his mind focused on clearing the air. He spoke calmly and collectedly, presenting his side of the story. He explained that Max was a well-trained dog, not prone to excessive barking. He told them about Max's excellent temperament and how he had been around children, other pets, and neighbors without causing any trouble. David also explained that he had always kept an eye on Max and made sure he was well-behaved, never allowing him to disturb the peace of the neighborhood. But as David spoke, he couldn't help but notice Karen's mounting frustration. She was glaring at him, her face red, her arms still firmly crossed. It was clear that she was not going to back down easily. However, David kept his composure and continued explaining, giving examples of the positive interactions Max had with the neighbors, even offering to let anyone who was concerned meet Max for themselves. The HOA members looked between David and Karen, their expressions mixed with confusion and concern. They clearly didn't know who to believe. As the conversation continued, David decided to bring something to the table that would change the course of the meeting entirely, something Karen had not anticipated. I think it's important for you all to know, David began, his voice steady, that I'm not just a dog owner. I am also a veterinarian. I have spent years studying animal behavior and care, and I have a deep understanding of dogs and their needs. I can assure you that Max is not the problem here. He is a well-adjusted, happy dog, and I have worked extensively to ensure that he is a positive member of this community. The room went quiet. David could see the shock on Karen's face as she processed the revelation. The HOA members exchanged glances, their skepticism now turning into curiosity. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was clearly stunned by this new piece of information. David continued, as a professional, I can tell you that Max's behavior is perfectly normal for a dog of his breed. I've trained him, and I've made sure he is not a disturbance. If you have any concerns about his behavior, I would be happy to meet with you individually and provide insight into his training and the steps I take to ensure he remains calm. The members of the HOA were now visibly impressed. Some had already been familiar with David's reputation as a local vet, but they had never realized the extent of his expertise. David was no longer just a neighbor with a dog. He was someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. And the more he spoke, the more Karen's grip on the situation loosened. At this point, Karen's posture became more rigid, her arms still crossed as though she was trying to hold onto some semblance of control. But David's calm and rational approach made her look increasingly out of place. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair as David continued to speak, citing his professional experience and offering solutions to any problems that might arise in the future. It became clear to the HOA members that Karen's complaint had little merit. David's professional background had not only proven that Max was well-behaved, but also highlighted the possibility that Karen's complaint was based more on personal preference than any genuine concern. As David finished explaining, the board members seemed to come to a unanimous conclusion. Karen's claims were exaggerated, and there was no real reason to take action against Max. Before the meeting could continue, Karen opened her mouth again, but this time her voice was quieter. But, she stammered, clearly rattled, I still believe that the dog is a nuisance. You can't just let things slide like this. David stood his ground, offering one final piece of advice. Karen, I understand that you may not be familiar with dogs or their behavior. I am more than happy to work with you, to give you information, or even let you observe Max in a controlled environment. But I assure you, this is not something that needs to be turned into an issue for the entire neighborhood. The HOA members, now fully in support of David's position, gently redirected the conversation. They suggested that Karen might consider a more measured approach and that further complaints would only cause unnecessary tension in the community. Karen's face reddened with embarrassment, but there was nothing more she could say. The meeting came to an end, and the HOA members adjourned with the understanding that there was no case to answer. David had won, but the surprise wasn't just the outcome. It was how effortlessly his professionalism had turned the tide in his favor. Karen's attempt to disrupt the peaceful community had backfired, and the HOA members left the room impressed with David's calm and authoritative presence. In the days that followed the HOA meeting, David hoped for a return to normalcy. He had expected things to settle down, with Karen retreating into her corner, perhaps reevaluating her approach to neighborhood disputes. But Karen, it seemed, was not one to let go of things easily, especially when her sense of control had been challenged so publicly. The initial relief David felt after the meeting slowly gave way to unease as he began to notice that Karen wasn't done with the issue. Far from it. Karen, now determined to have the last word, began to spread rumors around the neighborhood, not just about Max but about David as well. Her whispers, though subtle, painted Max as a dangerous dog, one whose presence was nothing short of a threat to the peace of the entire community. She would casually drop these comments to neighbors as she passed them, making sure to build a case in her mind that Max was a constant menace, even though every neighbor who had interacted with the dog knew this was far from the truth. David, for his part, kept his distance. He didn't engage in any confrontations, refusing to stoop to her level. Instead, he continued to do what he did best, tending to his practice and taking care of animals. However, the impact of Karen's whispers started to creep into the daily life of the neighborhood. Some neighbors, who had initially been on the fence, began to take her side, asking questions about Max or expressing doubts about having a dog like him so close by. The tension, although subtle, began to build. David's professional demeanor and reputation, however, remained untouched. He began to notice that more people were stopping by his clinic, asking for advice not just on their pets, but on how to handle neighborhood disputes. Word of his calm, knowledgeable approach spread, and people started seeing him not only as a veterinarian, but as a pillar of the community. They admired his ability to stay cool under pressure, even when someone like Karen tried to turn him into a villain. But Karen wasn't done yet. After weeks of unsuccessfully trying to turn the neighborhood against David, she decided to escalate things further. In an attempt to take action on her grievances, she contacted the HOA once again, this time demanding that David be fined for violating neighborhood peace and tranquility. She suggested that Max's presence had created an unsafe environment and that the HOA needed to step in and punish David for his disregard for the rules. But the HOA had already made its decision, and David's track record, both as a vet and as a responsible dog owner, spoke for itself. When Karen's complaint was dismissed once again, she seemed to hit a wall. Her final attempt to create trouble was met with indifference from the HOA board and the majority of the neighborhood. Karen, frustrated and clearly rattled, found herself growing more and more isolated. People began to avoid her, sensing that her motivations were less about the well-being of the community and more about her own desire for control. As Karen's reputation crumbled, David solidified even further. The once quiet neighborhood became a place where neighbors looked out for one another, more united than ever before. David's practice grew as he gained more clients, many of them referred by those who had witnessed his handling of the situation. What had begun as a petty complaint from a single disgruntled neighbor had ultimately turned into an opportunity for David to showcase his expertise and commitment to the community. The real turning point came when the HOA, recognizing David's positive influence, invited him to host a community event on responsible pet ownership. David was more than happy to accept, eager to bring the neighbors together and share his knowledge about caring for pets. The event, which was intended to foster a sense of unity, was a massive success. Residents from all walks of life came together to learn about responsible pet care, animal behavior, and how to build a stronger, more supportive community. David even brought Max along, and the dog's gentle demeanor won over everyone who had been initially skeptical. The event concluded with neighbors exchanging ideas about how to improve the community, and Max became the unofficial mascot of the gathering. Karen, meanwhile, remained absent from the event. She had not only distanced herself from the people she once tried to influence, but had also dug herself into a hole so deep that there was no way out. Her behavior had alienated her from the very community she had sought to control. Where she had hoped for chaos, she had instead sown the seeds of unity and support for David. The neighborhood was now more bonded than ever, and David's standing as a trusted professional in the community was only further solidified. Months passed, and Karen's attempts to re-enter the fold became fewer and fewer. Her reputation, tarnished by her own actions, had no place in the community anymore. As for David, he continued to lead his life with the same quiet confidence he always had. He took pride in knowing that he had not only defended his dog, but had turned a difficult situation into a chance to build something positive. The neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of unity, rational thinking, and, perhaps most importantly, the power of calmness in the face of adversity. As the seasons changed, David often found himself reflecting on the bizarre journey he had experienced. He had faced a woman who had tried to create division, who had tried to take away the peaceful life he had built, and who had sought to make him the villain. But in the end, it wasn't Karen who had triumphed. It was David, and with him, the entire neighborhood. In the end, the victory wasn't just about the dog or the HOA. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity and showing that kindness and expertise will always win out over bitterness and fear. David's success wasn't just in silencing the complaints. It was in creating a community that would never allow negativity to win.